Nick van der Horst, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. It's a pleasure to have you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Apologies again for butchering your name. I'm just gonna roll with it, and I haven't offended you, so we're all good.
Stick with Nick. We'll be fine.
Stick with Nick. Stick with Nick. That is the aim of this episode. Stick with Nick. So, Nick, anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you mind just giving us a bit of a brief bio and how you ended up at PSV?
Yeah, sure. I guess it all started with playing football myself. Loved playing it, loved the game. Used to play some professional youth football, also for the youth national teams, and was thinking, okay, if football doesn't turn out the way I want it to, then I need something extra, and that's when I started the physiotherapy education. So football didn't turn out the way I wanted to, and from there I did the physiotherapy education, and I went to a clinic in Holland, seeing all kinds of patients, athletes with numerous of problems, injuries, systemic diseases, all of it. I worked there for 10 years. I think it was very nice to build experience also on an orthopedic level, but also in a variety of cases. And it was a clinic where we also did a lot of education with the physiotherapy education in Utrecht. So I was always interested in what am I going to do to study more. So after a few years in the clinic, I started physiotherapy science, which is a master degree in Holland, and sports physical therapy, because I was obviously interested in the sports side of physiotherapy. Finishing that education, that led to a PhD position at the sports science department of Utrecht. I got my PhD on studies on hamstring injury prevention and return to play after hamstring injuries. And then when I finished my PhD, I thought, okay, I have some clinical experience now. I've developed myself with education and experience. Football was less and less, so this is the moment I'm ready to make a step to elite football, and that's when I started at Go Ahead Eagles, football club in Holland, at the highest level, where I worked as a sports physio, and I moved to the KNVB, our National Football Association, where I was more focused on the rehabilitation side of professional football players, mainly ACL injuries, Achilles tendon injuries, like the long-term injuries. We had a very big and nice rehabilitation center there. A lot of clinical expertise again, and then so then from the KNVB, I moved to PSV Eindhoven, where they were looking for a physio with experience in rehabilitation, and got the job there. Still on that job, working with all the players in the first team, mainly responsible for the rehabilitation processes. That it's not just me treating them. Of course, we have a team of physios, S&C coaches, doctors, nutritionists, but I sort of coordinate the rehab processes, and I also work with the team that's healthy, because they also need some treatment every now and then. But I try to mainly focus on the injured players. So that's where I'm still at. Some research projects on the side still, and that's where I am right now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nick. When did you stop actually playing?
Well, technically,
Technically still going.
I started playing, I stopped playing, I think, when I moved to PSV Eindhoven, because the combination PSV trains in the weekend. I also have a family, 2 kids that require some attention, and daddy being gone on all weekends is it's not optimal. But I've played until I think until I was 20 for Utrecht and the national teams. And that's sort of the moment where you either make it to the first team or not. I didn't make it to the first team of Utrecht. Had a season in another club, Top Os, and then felt like I wasn't there. So I've continued to play on like like a high amateur level for another 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, which was also enjoyable. But yeah, then I had the physiotherapy next to it. So definitely in love with the game.
Mhm.
And every now and then I still try to play a bit. But yeah, it's a time thing right now.
Of course. You got further than I did, Nick. You got further than I did. So do you think that helps? And this is always an interesting one when it comes to pre-management and
Yeah,
coaches. Should you have played?
yeah,
But I'm always interested to hear it from the kind of
yeah,
further support staff, S&Cs
yeah,
and physios. You don't hear you hear a couple of S&Cs and sports scientists who've played at a good level.
yeah.
You don't hear that many physios who've played at a good level
No,
and end up in physio. Do you think that helps you from a communication perspective, relationship building perspective, but also just knowing what things feel like and
yeah.
should feel like?
Well, I don't think it's a necessity. That definitely not. But I do feel like football has its own culture, like many sports. I used to work with more runners and sprinters. They have their own culture, which is completely different from footballers. And I think it does help understanding the culture, understanding the players, seeing where they're at, and also making that connection with the players, because obviously in a rehab setting you're going to be one on one a lot. Um, you have to know when to motivate them, how to get them to do the things that you want to do with them, even though they don't feel like doing some of the things that you would like them to do. So then building a good connection, I think, is very important. And I do a lot of on-field rehab as well. And I think in the on-field rehab, it's also nice if, if you want to kick a ball, pass a ball, do long balls, that yeah, I can do it as a physio as well. If not, for instance, I'm not a I'm not a good goalkeeper, but then we get somebody from the academy, a goalkeeper, to come in for the first team and help the players. So there's always a way. It's not a necessity, like I said, but it does help with the culture and building that connection with the players, who ultimately, it's about them, right? They need to perform, they need to uh, develop themselves, and they also need to understand what the plan is in a rehab setting, what the plan is from a development perspective. And maybe if you've been there yourself a bit, that yeah, you can help them.
It's just nice to be able to have someone that can, like you say, long balls, just strike a ball back to
Yeah,
the player, and
yeah,
they're not having to run all over for it. It actually gets to them. Yeah, I mean, it's a simple thing, but
yeah,
it's like, what would you do if you couldn't and you were terrible, like, and the players running all over the place?
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Anyway, yeah.
yeah. It can
But
help.
yeah, from a rehab perspective, what's your well? Let's start with the injury prevention side. What's your kind of overall package philosophy when it comes to
Yeah,
injury prevention? Because that'll be the kind of next 40 minutes or
yeah.
so for this
I
this conversation. Can you package that for
Yeah,
us?
of course. So one of the quotes that I often use for rehab and also for prevention that I really like is keep the main thing the main thing. And I know that when we talk about prevention, there's not a lot of evidence out there on what's effective. There are a lot of studies, but very few high quality studies. And basically, if you shave it off, all of it, then you would say that eccentric strength training has some evidence in terms of, for instance, hamstring injury prevention. Um, and we're contemplating still on load management and load, how to define it, how to qualify it. Core stability, we still don't know how to quantify it, how to measure it, or what it is. So there's not a lot of strong evidence out there, but I think we all agree that in essence, load and load management is is key in terms of preventing soft tissue injuries and hamstring injuries in particular. And that means that you have to look at training and detraining. So you have to make sure that your players can withstand the load that's required. And you have to make sure that they recover from the load that's being put on them. Um, yeah, and that's for me the essential. I do believe, for instance, that other things can help on an individual level. There's a lot of recovery strategies out there: ice baths, switch baths, massages, dry needling, cupping. There's so much out there, but we have to focus on the main thing first. And if you got that done well, then you check it again, see if it can be improved. If you can improve it, do that first, and then if all of it is like yeah, put in place really well, then also look on an individual level. Okay, what can we add to the individual player, his needs, his requirements, and where can we see that? So for me, you have sort of a general line of evidence-based strategies that you can always implement, and then you screen the individual player, monitor the individual player on individual needs that you add to that source. And in yeah, in fundamentally, that's for me my idea of a good prevention plan.
We'll come on to kind of best practice and evidence-based
Yeah.
stuff and how that actually fits into actual practice in a little while. But the term load management, especially in like the NBA and things like that, it's become a bit of a buzzword. But what does that mean to you? And we won't dive into what you specifically do at PSV, because I know that's for you guys.
Yeah.
But when it comes to load management and specifically hamstring injuries, and there's been some work come out in the last couple of weeks around recovery, safe recovery, and post game, in terms of how long it takes to recover from these games when it comes to hammy injuries. But what does load management mean to you in terms of hamstring injuries and how you would tackle it?
I love that you mentioned that study. It was the study where Mendegucha also had also put in it, where they actually saw that some of the injury risk markers for hamstring injuries were not recovered still after 3 days after the game, so post game, which is something to consider when you're designing your program, but also to consider if you're working in an elite environment where, for instance, you have a game on Sunday and then again a game on Wednesday and then a game again on Saturday. That means something. But I agree, load management is it's the same problem like core stability. It's a term, everybody uses it, but everybody means something else probably. So what does it really mean? For me, it's an umbrella term we say in Holland. It's like there's a lot into that, and what is primarily into that for me are the is the load where the player is at risk. So your sprints, your high intensity distances, your high intensity runs, your total distances that you run in a week, your strength training, what have you done, and then also when have you planned these things. So what did you do and when did you do it? Because I do believe that on an individual level, there are players who can withstand 6 kilometer runs every day or training sessions of 6K every day without breaking down. That's easy to them. And you have other players who can perfectly do a 12K game on Sunday, but really need 2 days after that to recover from it, and then again build slowly to make another game like 4 or 5 days later. So if you talk about load management, I think it's getting a very clear individual picture of the player, seeing what his needs are, objectifying where he's at. For instance, how is his hamstring strength? How does he tolerate load? How does he take care of his rehabilitation or his recovery? And then putting that all in a bowl and making a plan based on that. And in that plan, you can have, for instance, eccentric training. If you assess your player, for instance, you screen him on fascicle length or you screen him on hamstring strength, and you'd see that the player is weak and has short fascicles, and then probably you would want to do some eccentric training with that player to increase fascicle length to make him a bit stronger and reduce the injury risk there. But you also have to plan this. You cannot do this, for instance, the day before the game, because he will go into the game with muscle soreness. So that for me would then be load management, is to plan the individual needs of the player accordingly and making sure that he gets the right doses to develop at the right times, but also remains fresh for the moments he needs to peak when he needs to.
So let's go through that objectifying process so you understand what each individual player needs, and we'll have a little chat afterwards of how we manage all them individual needs
Yeah.
as well. But what's your objectification system look like, especially when it comes to hamstring injuries, of what people can tolerate and where they're at?
Yeah. It's a really nice one actually, because I think this is a little bit, if you find the truth here, it's a golden nugget. But for us, this incorporates our preseason screening, where we measure a lot of things. If we're talking hamstring specific, we are measuring hamstring isos at long length with the Nordboard. We are measuring Nordics, um, assessing those. We are measuring mobility, so the active knee extension test, straight leg raise tests, MH fake tests, all these tests. The Jordan tests, which is I really like it because it also looks at the contralateral limb and the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris mobility on the other side.
So Nick, what's that Jordan's
Jordan
screen?
test. It's
Jordan
I
test.
think it was in the publication by Johan Lati. It was described for the first time, because we always measure, for instance, an active knee extension test when we lie on our back and we pull one knee up 90 degrees, and then we look at the angle that the lower leg makes, right? But the contralateral limb, the iliopsoas, actually has a big influence on your pelvis. So if there is no mobility of the contralateral iliopsoas in running, that will mean something. It's hard to say. I would need a picture, I guess. But if you, for instance, if you make a long stride, your hammy will feel a bit stretched on the left side. Let's say if your left leg is forward, but on the right side, the leg that's behind, the iliopsoas will be stretched. So there's mobility there in terms of where the pelvis transfers the energy from the one side to another. And it's very interesting to also look at mobility of your unilateral limb and the mobility of the iliopsoas on the contralateral limb, and combine the two. And the Jordan test is a test that sort of combines the mobility of the two elements. I think if you look it up, it will be much clearer, and it's very interesting to see because it gives a new dimension to our hamstring flexibility tests. So that's something that we measure, and then of course sprint times and worst case scenarios. All these things, when we talk about GPS and GPS data, are also very interesting to recognize when a player has spikes in his load or when not. I don't really believe that spikes are a problem. I think players need spikes, but again, they need them at the right moments and in the right times. And that's something that you can also foresee if you have a good data set of what a player does in training in games. Yeah, and we also do always some jump tests, counter movement tests, mid-thigh pull tests. So there's a lot going into that, and that sort of gives us a picture of where the player is at when he comes into PSV. And that's something that we also monitor, and where we, for instance, we always do a pre-activation before training. Then we look in the pre-activation. Okay, this is a guy with short fascicles and weak hamstrings. He needs some extra hamstring strength training at long lengths to address those risk factors. And he might need some sprinting on the field because he needs to be exposed, but to a certain amount, because if we go over it, we might overload the guy. So yeah, that's a little bit the process.
I'm really interested in the concept of kind of best practice and research based evidence,
Yeah.
and actually how that is embedded within a system that has to function optimally, efficiently with human beings. How do you decipher and use best practice as much as possible, but ensure that it fits your environment? Because I'm just thinking about the kind of younger practitioner who's hearing, needs to do Nordics, needs to look at mechanics when it comes to sprinting, needs to do X, needs to do Y, needs to do A, needs to do B, and thinking, how do I fit this within the 25 guys that I've got
Yeah.
in the 20 minutes that I've got every day?
Yeah.
So how do you go about going, okay, that's number one on the list in terms of the evidence that we've got available,
Yeah.
but that ain't gonna fit.
No,
It might be number one,
that's
but
so
number two
true.
and three and
And
four do fit.
yeah,
So how do you go about piecing that all together?
very
It's a
good
big question.
question. And yeah, we are with 4 physios, 3 S&C coaches, and we are already struggling with 25 players. So imagine if you're on your own with 2 hours around an amateur training session, and that's where you have to do your thing. That's really, really difficult. Um, but I also think that then planning and doing, keeping the main thing. So all these things with tests and counter movement jumps and these can be very interesting, of course. But I would start with the coach and the training sessions, because ultimately the coach will design the training sessions. For instance, a typical amateur team in Holland trains 2 or 3 times a week and has a game on Saturday or Sunday. Let's say they train on Tuesday and Thursday and have a game on Saturday. Yeah, then it would not be smart to have a crazy intensive and long session on Thursday, because they might have some fatigue 2 days later, and that's actually when they go into the game. So talking about with the coach, hey, if we want to do some conditioning, let's do that on a Tuesday. And maybe if we want to do some additional strength training, which can also give some DOMs and some issues there. Maybe we can do that best on Tuesday, and if we want an extra moment, maybe that would be after the game on Saturday, because then you don't have the muscle fatigue from Tuesday bringing into the game from Saturday, and after Saturday you have a day extra to recover again. So you have your fundamentals of injury prevention in place. You try to adapt the training load a bit. You try to give the guys some sprint exposure, make a plan. Let's say start with 6 times 60 meter runs at a certain time. See which guys, because there's always variations within your team. Some guys are just very fast and some guys are slow. So if you all make them run at the same time, that probably won't work. But maybe let one guy run 70 meters in the same time and one guy 60 meters in the same time, or give one guy 11 seconds and one guy 10 seconds for that 60 meters. Just um, get these fundamentals right: sprint exposure, some eccentric training, and some planning of the training load throughout the week. I think that would already be worth a lot in a setting like that. And then from there on, you can always think of, okay, the next step would be to individualize the prevention plan, and then I would focus on the guys with a history of hamstring injuries, because those are your guys at risk. Okay, do some extra for them first, and yeah, if you really have time or energy, then focus on the rest of the team. Make risk profiles based on your ideas, and we can dive into that as well. But yeah, move on from there.
Have you ever tried to incorporate post game lifting with your guys or previous roles?
Yeah, I have. When I was at Go Ahead Eagles, we used to do this, because I remember this was actually my first club, and we wanted to do. We didn't have a big group, and we wanted to keep them as fit as possible. So the coach basically said, Nick, whatever you want, I'll support you, but you have to think of what's best in terms of prevention. And I just want to I want the green light for all my training sessions, but what can we do extra? So we typically had one game a week there, because there was no European games or anything. So that means that you can make quite a nice structure in the week. We had one like intense training session. Typically, if we had a game on Friday night, because normally Friday night was our game, then we would train on Thursday and Wednesday, be off on Tuesday, and have an intense session on Monday, I believe. Then we said, okay, let's do some eccentrics on Monday after the conditioning session. And then I was really struggling to find a second moment, because the day before the game or 2 days before the game, with that eccentrics can give DOMs for about 48 hours, so you don't want to do that in those moments. And then we thought, yeah, why not do it after immediately after the game. So before the guys go to the press and all, we had like a 15-minute program. It was not that long, but it included some Nordics, some reverse Nordics, some calf exercises, quad exercises. Um, and in the beginning, there was some resistance from the players, but the coach helped. He was amazing. He was also in the gym to support us and to make sure that the guys were doing it. And actually took about 2 weeks. And after that, the players used that moment as well to just talk about the game, what happened, what went well, what could have been better, or celebrate a bit, do the exercises, and then went to the shower. And that was that. And yeah, it was a nice season. In terms of injury rates, it was not that high. I don't say this is what caused that, but that was nice to see. And yeah, I've seen it being implemented in other clubs as well. In my present role, I also see it implemented. So there's, I think there is some foundation to do it like this from a yeah, practical standpoint. You have to be pragmatic. Uh, because ideally you want to find 2 moments for your strength program, or you do mini dosing. That's another option, that you do mini dosing throughout the week, and you don't have high doses at certain time points in the week. This I've also seen at some clubs. So I don't know what the holy grail is yet, but yeah, it's interesting to see the differences and to form opinions on that. I really liked this way of post game and post conditioning strength training. Yeah, and there's also some studies that support it, actually, because there have been some studies that say that when you train eccentrically in fatigued state, it's more effective. Also in terms of fascicle length optimization. So yeah, I think from an evidence-based perspective, this is also a nice one.
What kind of volumes were you doing post game in that post conditioning? Sorry, on the Monday.
Yeah, not too crazy, and we the volumes were individualized. So there were because, for instance, if we talk about the Nordic, right? You can say let's do. I did a study with a protocol which had, like, I believe in the protocol it was 10 Nordics at some point. Yeah, it's too much, and it's also about how you do a Nordic, because one Nordic, if you do it full range of motion, can already be so intense. So time under tension is something that needs to be considered. The speed with what you're doing the Nordic needs to be considered. So back then we dosed it on an individual level. We looked at the play and we said, okay, you do it like this for this amount of reps and this amount of sets. But it was never. Uh, it's not like going to the gym and killing yourself. It's optimization. It's bringing the dose in from a prevention standpoint, but it's not like we have to be the strongest guys out there. They are not bodybuilders. They are football players. Yeah.
In the sessions that you do pre-training, how are you individualizing them? What do they look like? Could you give us any examples especially when it comes to the focus on reducing hamstring injury risk?
Yeah. So for me, of course, pain is a marker. Um, it's also a little bit experience, because of when we're talking hamstring injury, that's also an umbrella term. But because what is the hamstring? Is it a myofascial injury? Is it a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3? Is the tendon involved or not? Is it at the musculotendinous junction or the free tendon or the muscle belly? All these things matter in terms of how the contractile elements can withstand the load that you're applying, and that needs to be considered. So, in my opinion, I like to start early exercising. I also like to start with co-contractions, for instance. So you could work on the glutes with some co-contractions from the hamstrings, or you could work on the calves or the quads, and there would be some co-contractions there as well. Um, I like to start isometrically, because I think it's a safe way of training, and the players in the early stages um, know very well what their limit is, and they can also provide good feedback. And yeah, the feedback is also important to see how much you can load them. I don't really believe in 3 times 15 repetitions. I know that's something that you often give, but if the guy can do 60, why would you then do 3 times 15? If he can do 60, I will bring him up to 60. And then another set of 60, because that's then what he can withstand. Or we up the load a bit, or we up the speed a little bit, but not in the early phases yet. In the early phases, I'm quite controlled, because you're also still dealing with tissue healing, depending on the injury type. Yeah, and from there on, I try to look, and Jermaine, he was on your podcast as well, Jermaine
I
McCubbin,
certainly was.
and I heard him say a very nice thing. We start with the end product in mind, or the goal in mind, and I think that's the truth. So, for instance, once they are able to jog with after a hamstring injury, can be relatively fast and relatively safe, because if you jog, you don't have that big range of motion yet. There's not a big stretch on the hamstring, and there's not a lot of force applied to the hamstring. Then I think it's also good to assess, does he have, for instance, the power to jog? If he has the power, then go to capacity. We know that the players on average train with 5 to 6 kilometers, and a game is even 12, for instance. But let's try to build him up to 5K as soon as possible, and make sure that he gets that 35K of running in a week already in there. Because if they can do it and it's safe, then it's also very important, in my opinion, to build capacity in that sense. And that's how I also look at my exercise progression, because that's where we started the question. Isometrically, if he can do 60 reps, we'll do 60 reps. If he can do 5 times 5 second holds, we'll do 5 times 5 second holds. And we don't want to over exercise the system in the early phases, but if it's safe, if it's controlled, then this is for me a very important thing, to really train and not just be busy, but really train the muscles that you want to address, and then the system that you want to address, and then that grows, and yeah, you will make him more resilient for the load that you want to apply in later stages, and that's how you build them. And then we have at PSV, we have a structure where we also test then isometrically. So, for instance, in those early stages, first we test with a microfed handheld dynamometer, or we test isometrically with the Nordboard, or we use the McCall test, which is also a really nice test. There's a publication on that as well. You lie supine with the hip 30 degree or 90 degrees, and the knee also in an angle, and from there on you push the heel against the force plate isometrically. It gives you not only uh, uh, an idea of how strong the player is, but also the rate of force development, also the power that's applied. So it gives you a lot of information, and if that's solid, if we are happy with that, left and right are compared and that's good, or we have baseline measurements and that's good, then we put them on the field. We go for running, but they start with easy jogging. If that goes well, our strength progression would be that they go into some eccentric movements, and if he's eccentrically within 50%, 15%, then we can say, okay, we also up the speeds in on the field. We go up to 24, 28 kilometers per hour, and only when they are completely free in the gym and all the strength measurements are optimal, that's when we allow them to sprint. And that's how we basically build up the strength program and the field program.
Has there been any? This is a slightly general question, but I think it's an interesting one, if I do say so myself. Is there anything that you've removed from your rehab when it comes to hamstrings in the last 12 months, for example, that maybe wasn't giving you what you thought it might, or it was becoming a time sapper? Like anything that you removed in that program?
That's a very, very good one. I've added a lot of things because of
Okay.
with
Yeah, yeah.
ongoing knowledge.
Yeah.
Um,
So what have you added? What have you added?
what I've added, what I'm working a lot with right now is mobility. I have a real. I'm
Talk to us about
working
that.
on a publication as well. Um, let me start first with what I've removed. I've removed quite. I'm even stronger on hands-on uh, things like cupping and dry needling, and those are for me. Unless the player really feels it works, then there's a placebo effect there. You can use that, but for me, it has no place in the program. So that would be something that I've removed, and I'm quite careful with we call it the pendel in Dutch, like the long range of motion that you make when you sprint. Um, uh, I stay away from that in the early phases because I think it provides quite a stretch in the beginning, and I used to not do it, but maybe get there progressively a bit. But I'm a bit more careful on that. That will come in the end phases. But mobility for me is a very important one. I think there's some really nice studies we can learn from in relation to groin injuries as well, where, for instance, if you look who guys who can shoot a ball really hard, they're not the guys with the biggest adductors or the biggest quads. It's all technical, and they've looked at, for instance, amateur football players and professional football players, and they saw that the tension arc, which is if a guy in football shoots a ball, they throw their arms back and they throw their other leg back, and from there they make a tension arc, which they then release sort of to hit the ball, and then the energy is transferred to the ball and the ball goes away with a certain amount of speed. They show that amateur players actually have a much smaller tension arc than professional football players, and I think that's because if you make a very big tension arc, you already store a lot of energy. It's the same with a baseball throw. If I have a very big external rotation, I store a lot of energy and I just have to release that when I throw. It's not like it's a concentric action of my shoulder muscles. No, it's just a release of the pre-stretch. And I think in sprinting it works a bit the same, and that the pelvis, the mobility of the pelvis, the mobility of your iliopsoas, the mobility of your hamstrings is very important to generate these forces and to be able to move more efficiently. So, because in the end, the pelvis is the part where the legs constantly are switched, where the energy is transferred. And yeah, this has to be mobile and also stiff at the same point to make sure that the energy is efficient and you don't have to work the muscles too much. So what I've added a lot is yeah, glute work, obviously, but also for me, core stability is not only active, it's also passively. Is there enough mobility for the iliopsoas on both sides? Um, is the energy transfer while sprinting sufficient? This is something that I've definitely added in the program. Yeah. I can talk an hour on this, but yeah.
So when you say mobility, give us like, I know it's difficult when it's just audio and you're
Yeah.
those who aren't listening, they can't see you kind of
No, but
gesturing with your hands. What does mobility look like?
yeah, like so if you analyze sprinting, and I say again that a lot of the energy is transferred through the pelvis, that means that there should be enough rotation on the pelvis, because like I said, you constantly switch and there's rotation there in the pelvis, the lower back, the SE joint, which is very important there. So I think that's something where you need to be mobile. The muscles that are there, the hamstrings especially, the glutes, and also the iliopsoas are very important, that they are mobile enough to create enough mobility for the front and back leg. Because if for instance, the iliopsoas is very stiff, then you don't have a long backswing, which means that in order to generate forces, you have to work with less mobility. Whereas if you have a lot of mobility, you store more energy and you move, in my opinion, more efficient. So that's definitely high up that list when I talk about mobility. And also I always check the spine. But with that, I say I always check the spine, but I'm not a manual therapist, and we have very good manual therapists at PSV. So I have to be honest that I always ask my colleagues, say, hey, can you look at the spine? at the lower back, and do you think there are any mobility deficits? If so, can you address them? If not, then I know enough, and we'll work again. So yeah. And the Jordan test, like I said, I mentioned it earlier, is I think a very nice one to dive into if you're interested on this topic. Yeah.
So that was Johan Latty's paper that was first introduced.
Yeah,
Is that right?
I can send it, or maybe you can add
Course.
it to this podcast.
Yeah.
It's really
That's
nice.
fine.
Yeah.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Great. Well, Nick, I know I've taken a lot of your afternoon where you probably should be working. So I'm going to say thank you very much. But anyone that wants to dive into your PhD work, anything you've got going on, I know you've got you do events and things like that, or you've got an event coming up. So what's the best place for people to contact you?
Can I add my contact details to the podcast?
Course.
Then people can reach
100%.
out, and if they are interested on this or they want to hear anything more, I'm always open to learn and also to share ideas. So yeah,
100%.
yeah.
Any social media?
Yeah, I'm most
LinkedIn?
active on LinkedIn actually.
Okay.
So find me on LinkedIn, and there we'll be fine. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Well, and lastly, I appreciate Jermaine making the introduction,
Yeah.
and sending me your number. So
Props to him.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. But no, Nick, thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate it, and look forward to keeping in touch in the future.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, mate.